Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it 30 seconds just to let everyone connect. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, because those numbers are creeping up very steadily. So let's kick off because we're 1 minute past the hour and we have a lot to get on with the next hour. So good afternoon and welcome to IB Europe's dedicated webinar to the Transparency and Consent Framework, also known as the TCF. Today we will be sharing an overview of the main differences between the TCF policy 3.5 and 4.0. We'll first start with a presentation and then we will have an audience Q&A. And as we are live today, you can put any questions that you do have, if you put those into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom interface, and then my colleague will address those to our speakers. We are recording today's session. We'll be sharing this on our website within the next 24 hours. Any questions that we are unable to take today, please don't worry, we will take all of these from anything that's stored in the Q&A, and we will be putting those into our FAQs, but also to let you know that for the different stakeholder groups, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be organising dedicated webinars, one for vendors, one for publishers, and one for CMPs. So that will be more of an opportunity to do a deep dive on the policy and the technical changes for your particular stakeholder group, and you can ask more questions within those sessions. And of course, framework at ibeurope.eu is open at all times to receive anything else that comes in then. So I am delighted to introduce my colleague Ninon Wagner, who is our Privacy Director at IB Europe. Ninon is going to give an overview to the agenda and introduce today's speakers. So over to you, Ninon.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen, and hello, everyone. So first, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So all of them are really active contributors are in the TCF working group, which is mandated to develop and revise the TCF policies to make sure that they remain up to date with data protection authority guidelines and case law. So we have Christoph Zippel, Senior Legal Counsel at RTL, who also chairs the TCF Policy Working Group, Elena Turtureanu, VP Legal and Privacy at Adform, and also Jan Winkler, who's the CEO of Consentmanager and Vice Chair of the Policy Working Group. We also have Peter Craddock on the webinar, who's IB Europe's Counsel, and he will be there for the Q&A at the end. So we have a really good panel of TCF experts, also from companies that implement the TCF in different capacities, so as publisher, vendor, and CMP. So they will be able to provide you with a really good overview of the upcoming changes to the TCF policies. So thanks to them for being there today. Maybe we can move to the next slide, looking at the agenda. Maybe just before I move to the agenda, a couple of words about the context about this upcoming version of the TCF, because some might be surprised that we are announcing iteration to the TCF 1 month after having obtained a voluntary suspension from the APD in our litigation. So, and indeed, IB Europe is no longer required to execute the set of corrective measures, including the action plan that has been validated by the APD. But nonetheless, there has been very strong market feedback for the TCF to continue to evolve, also pending the court proceeding, and also response to the criticism and concern that have been raised not only in the APD decision, but also elsewhere, and adapt, in fact, onto the most recent guidelines from Data Protection Authority, as well as the most recent case law. So the TCF instances have worked quite intensively over the past few months, and the main focus of this iteration is really about improving the manner in which users are informed and provided controls over the processing of their personal data. So we are going to go over the removal of, well, first the timeline, and I will hand over to Christoph for that. And then, so the main changes to the policy, which includes the removal of the legitimate interest legal basis for purposes relating to personalization of ads and content. Then the revision of the user-facing standard text to make it more understandable, as well as the standardization of additional information about vendors' practices. Fourth, a new requirement to disclose the number of vendors on the first layer of CMP user interface for increased transparency. And finally, an improved and clearer policy in relation to the withdrawal of consent. So our speakers are going to go over all of this change in more detail, and we will have time for the Q&A as Elena explained. So please do not hesitate to ask questions, and if some questions are not answered, we are going to work on a dedicated FAQ so that all of them are addressed. Last small point of clarification at the bottom of the slide. This is about the versioning, because the title of this webinar is policy changes from 3.5 to 4.0. So the policy version will indeed move from 3.5 to 4. The versioning is based on the actual changes that we made progressively since the TCF was first created, and to keep track of the different iterations. But we refer globally to TCF v2.2 for this iteration, which corresponds to the new version of the technical specification. So same as before, no confusion about that. I will hand over now to Christoph to go over the timeline for this new iteration.
Thank you, Nino. So we need another one. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, thank you, Nino. Let me just give you a short update on the timeline. The 2.2 version of TCF will be released on the 15th of May. The deadline for vendors to update their registration is the 30th of May, and the 30th of September is the deadline for supporting the version 2.2, which also means that is the date for deprecation of version 2.1. There will be a dedicated webinar at 5 p.m. on the technical changes, and as mentioned, there will be upcoming webinars for each categories for vendors, CMPs, publishers. There's also minor updates to the technical specification, and as mentioned again, you can ask any questions to the email framework at IAB Europe EU. So this is just like a ballpark overview on the timeline, and we will get into details regarding the changes. And the next slide is for Elena, I think.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, here it is. Thank you very much for joining and for spending your afternoon or maybe morning, depending where you are. And to the first and the most significant update with respect to the TCF policies, we have the removal of the legitimate interest for purpose 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those are the purpose 3, create personalized ads, purpose 4, select personalized ads, purpose 5, create personalized content profile, and 6, select personalized content. So under the status quo under the current TCF policies is that, and the specs permit vendors to select for all of these 3 to 6 purposes, either consent or legitimate interest, or for opt-in, or to select a flexible legal basis, being required, however, to select one of the default legal bases. Now with the change, so with this change, the legitimate interest will be entirely removed for this for purposes. So vendors will not be anymore permitted to select LI, and it will be completely switched over to consent. The reason why it resides obviously in the Belgium's APD decision, which was put into and the sanctions accordingly. And to quote, the defendant must prohibit by its terms of use the organizations participating in the current version of the TCF basing the lawfulness of the intended processing activities on the legitimate interest. In addition to the Belgian IPD, we've also noticed there were some other data protection authorities as well as EDPP guidance out there that have expressed concerns with respect to the reliance of legitimate interest as a lawful legal basis. I was very curious and I had a look at the GVL registration and I noticed that already some of the vendors have already switched their declared legal basis from legitimate interest to consent. So I think there is already a trend out there, and that is, I assume that is in the context of already anticipating, APD's decision back then. I think that is then next slide.
And I think that is for me again. Thank you. So the version 2.2 entails a review and improve TCF purposes, features, and also taxonomy. And all this has been done in order to make the user-facing disclosures more easily understandable, especially for end users. And this involves, and we spend a lot of time going through every purpose, new names for the TCF purposes and features. What we also did is we removed the legal text. There was originally a split between user-friendly language and legal language, and this has been replaced by new and more detailed user-friendly and only user-friendly descriptions. There are now illustrations. There will be illustrations per purpose. And those should be made available to end users as well on the second layer of a CMP UI. And the new version will also have new features that explain means of processing. For example, linking of identifiers or sharing data with other entities and services. And we've introduced that to make it clearer what is actually happening between vendors, because that might not have been as consistent as it could have been in the prior version. So you can see the new version under the link in the description below, and there will of course be translations, and those will be made available progressively as well. Of course, we have to translate this once it is finalized in all languages. Why did we do this? Actually, the legal texts have been criticized to be too complicated, and those do probably not, or one can have the opinion that it does not meet the requirements of the GDPR to have user-friendly, understandable text. So that's why we have decided to just condense this and have user-friendly text only. So next slide, please.
Yeah, I think that's me. So the one thing, or the next thing that we did is we will add information for vendors. So in the CMP, basically, when you go to the custom settings or custom choices, you have the list of the vendors, and then for each vendor, you will see some information. You currently already see some information. In the future, you will see more information. The first thing that will be added is the categories of data. So the data that these vendors process. There is a taxonomy behind it. So basically a catalog where we say these types of data can be chosen or can be processed by vendors. The vendors will, when they register, they will have the possibility to, to choose from these categories. The whole information will be in this GVL, so that the CMPs can take the vendor information, display it to the user, so that the user understands better what kind of data is processed. The categories, just to give you some examples, is, for example, IP addresses, device characteristics, device identifiers, probabilistic identifiers, authentication-driven identifiers, browsing and interaction data, user-provided data, non-precise data, non-precise and precise geolocation data, user profiles, and privacy choices. So that's the categories that will happen. And I said the why behind it is GDPR has a requirement to list or show the categories of processed data, and with this we basically ensure that this will happen and that the transparency is given to the user. And next slide.
So the next thing, or the next change that that is applicable to this TCF policies will be, as outlined by Jan, vendors will be required to disclose their data retention periods with respect, that must be declared per purpose. And right now, if we look in the current policies, TCF is silent with respect to the data retention and besides, of course, the quicker lifetime, which is slightly different thing. And to give, for example, an example, if we think of like a DMP that where the audience data is stored, that usually advertisers would have like much more shorter period where the audience data is required to be stored. So that is why vendors will have to declare what are their data retention period in numbers of days per purposes within the TCF policies registration. So that declaration will have to be made upon registration, and it will be visible to the users, as Jan already outlined, within the second layer of the CMP. And the reason why the data retention period is added to the TCF policies, it also resides within the APG's decision, and that is that basically will supplement and will add TCF compliance with respect to the transparency and information obligation, that is the Article 12, 13, and 14. And that is not only as with other changes and that will be brought with this TCF policy update. There have been other data protection authorities that have expressed concerns and with respect to the more transparencies on what happens with the data and for how long that is stored. I think that is the next slide, please.
Yeah, and I guess it's me again. There's another requirement for vendors to give additional information when they rely on legitimate interest as legal basis. So if a vendor wants to use legitimate interest as legal basis, there needs to be a link to an explanation about the legitimate interest at stake. And practices will look like that vendors will declare in a dedicated URL at registration, where they provide information about the legitimate interest at stake, and CMPs will be able to retrieve this URL and show it in the CMP. So why did we add this? Actually, the Belgian Data Protection Authority said that users were not informed about the legitimate interest at stake. They were actually informed that a vendor is relying on legitimate interest, but not on the legitimate interest that is there, which can differ from vendor to vendor and from use case to use case. And so that is why we added this requirements for vendors, also for the secondary layer of the UI. So next slide, please. Which is also for me, and there will be another new requirement, this time on the first layer. And that is to disclose the total number of vendors that are seeking consent or processing data on legitimate interest on the first layer. In practice, it will look like the example given here, that each publisher and the CMP will need to add in the first layer UI a number of third-party vendors, and this can be TCF vendors as well as non-TCF vendors, custom vendors that are chosen by a publisher, and state that those are the partners that will access data, will process data based on the consent given. Publishers are here strongly encouraged to make actually a selection of vendors and not to onboard the whole GVL in their CMP, because it will be quite a lot of vendors in this case being shown on the first layer. And actually there are some examples where there are lots of vendors that are not actually being used or being displayed in the CMP. Why did we add this? Actually, the Belgian Data Protection Authority says that a user does not really have an expectation or does not really know how many vendors or how many third partners are likely to process their data when they consent or when they use a website. And this can be sometimes a very high number. So this number is added to give an impression here. And also the CNIL recommends disclosing this as well. And so this is why we added this requirement, which will be very prominent as it's on the first layer, but I think can easily fit into the UI of a first layer. So next slide, please.
And that's me. So the fifth and in this course here, the last change is the improved policy on the withdrawal of consent. So basically, if you have the possibility to accept all, so to have an accept all link, you need to have a similar possibility to withdraw all. That's basically two things. The one is a requirement to have some kind of link icon action thing on your page. Usually on most sites you will see some icon in the corner or some link at the bottom that will resurface the consent layer so that the users can change their choices. That's the one part. The other part is if there is a button or an action that is consent to all or accept all or something similar, then when resurfacing this consent layer, you also need a option to reject everything. So withdraw consent to all or reject all or something similar there. So basically make it as easy as possible to reject as to accept it as it was accepted before. The reason behind it, again, it's the Belgian Data Protection Authority. So they basically said it's not always as easy for users to withdraw the consent as it was given. Hence, we put it in a policy so that we can make it sufficiently easy. Next slide.
I think that is for all of us. And Jan, I guess you start as a CMP.
I'm a CMP. Let me start. Yeah. So, how can you participate? Or how can TCF participants anticipate the V2? So, what can you do in order to prepare? So, from the CMP side, obviously there will be more technical changes in order to reflect the policy changes. The one most obvious thing is there is some more information in the GVL, as we just discussed before. So you will need to have the new version of this GVL. It's on a new URL. There is some new fields in it. So you will need to update your technology a bit. And then from the information that you get from the GVL, you will need to update the UI and what you display. As said before, for example, you will have to show the number of vendors or the data categories, etc. So there is some technical changes that will need to be done. Elena, you want to continue with vendors?
Yes, that is from the vendor side. So the first one that will be for vendors to update, like to make sure their live installation, they can retrieve properly the TCF signal. And for example, if there will be new features, then that must be maintained so that they can properly read and act upon those features. Then with respect to the TCF registration, review their TCF registration, provide additional information, be the data categories, be the data retention periods, and definitely the one with respect to the legal bases for the purposes 3 and 6 to ensure that they that consent is the only legal basis, and that will be the only legal basis that will be permitted anyway.
Yeah,
and I think that is Christoph for the publishers.
Yeah, yeah, I do for the publishers. Yeah. So for publisher side, publishers need to make sure that the CMP UI can be resurfaced by user easily. I think most publishers have that already, but please double check if you have it implemented like this. And the other thing is might be a bit more time consuming, but I really urge publishers to do that, is to review and more or less do a due diligence on the vendors that are implemented on the in their CMP, because and maybe reduce it or add where someone is missing to like have a list of vendors which are actually potentially processing data and not the whole GVL or large parts of GVL, which might never be active on your website. So back to Nino, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And we are right on time to have enough time for the question. And we already have a number of open questions right now. So I'm going to try to go through them and direct them to each of you, Elena, Jan, and Christoph. The first one in relation to the use of feature, I think that needs clarification. A question about whether it's possible to rely on legitimate interest for the features of matching and combining of data, linking different devices, receiving and using automatically sent device characteristics for identification. So I think, Elena, you might be able to explain what features mean exactly.
As those exactly. So for when it comes to processing the data for any of the features, you must have first and foremost established already a legal basis. So if you have already established a legal basis for 3 and 4, then you will be able to also process the data under the various features. And yeah, so that is the short answer to this.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Another question from Joshua. So will legitimate interest for fraud detection still be supported under the updated policy? So I think, Christoph, you might want to take this one, also in relation to special purpose one, maybe.
Yes, it will, but it has a very limited scope. With and we went through the purposes and looked on how participants are using it, but it will still be there. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Melanie that I'm going to ask to Jan, who has lots of publisher client, I think. You will be able to answer. So if legitimate interest is removed from purposes 3 to 6, does this mean that Google limited ads won't work anymore?
Yes and no. In principle, Google limited ads did not need legitimate interest before, but yes, it does not make super much commercial sense to use limited ads. If you anyway have consent, then you can just use the full Google ads. So if you want to limit your ads due to other reasons than not having consent, then sure, you can still use it. But indeed, without legitimate interest, the impact is not so high anymore.
Yeah, maybe one point of clarification. So I think, yeah, limited ad is a contextual solution, so it does not rely on purposes 3 to 6. But the best thing, as always, is always to ask the question to the vendor if you have a question about their solution. A question about the removal, the non-removal of legitimate interest, rather, for purpose 7, the measurement of ad performance. I think, Elena, will you want to take this one?
Yeah, so that the purpose 7 will still remain under the legitimate interest, and as it was before.
Yeah, I cannot close the question, though. I think you need to do that. So I think, yeah, thank you. I think that there is I'm not sure that I understand Julia's question. So, and if so for the earlier obtained consent, what would be new TCF reasons? So maybe if you can clarify the question in the Q&A, and we will return to it just after. Will there be, so a question from Antonio, will there be any standardization with regards to the UI UX patterns employed by CMPs when requesting consent, particularly when declining all or some of the requested consent categories? There is also a link to a study. I'm not sure if Jan, you want to take this one, and maybe I can complete as well.
I mean, from the policy side, I mean, there is already some indications what you can do and cannot do, how the CMP should look like or should not look like. Still, at the end, it's a publisher thing. The publishers want their own colors, they want their own designs. Everybody has different needs and different wishes and different legal interpretation also. So there is always room for everything a bit. I think from the policy side, we try to make sure that what the authorities are asking is kind of covered by the policy. But I guess there will never be like a uniform consent layer. That's just there's too much variables in there. Yeah.
Maybe to add to that, there is already UI requirements and in the current version, and we did not add that much. I mean, actually, every CMP should have their own freedom to design within the boundaries that are in the policies, but there is no strict UI requirements because this would not look good on certain interfaces on websites, apps, and we probably cannot and do not want to set this for the whole industry. So it's still like ballpark broad guidelines, but not the UI requirements.
Yeah. Thank you. So, and yeah, just to come back on the policy. So right now there is dedicated UI requirement for the size of the primary call to action, as well as their contrast ratio. So this is already a clear rule when it comes to black patterns. And there is also the requirement to make sure that the choices for consent are opt-out by default, so unchecked by default. So there are a number of rules, but it's not excluded that in the future we will add additional ones, also based on data protection authority guidelines. A question about how the number of partners is going to be managed due to publishers constantly using and changing the number of vendors. So is this going to be automated? Because if manual, it would create a lot of work. I think it's probably a question for you, Jan, as a CMP owner.
Yeah, from the CMP side, so in our case, there is basically in the text, you have a macro where you say, okay, here, put the number, please, and the CMP will automatically put the current number in there. The question in this case goes a bit further, meaning what happens to all the DSPs and SSPs where you don't really know what's on the second level and third level. Actually, at least that's the question. From the legal perspective or from the CMP perspective, I would say, actually, you should have known how many vendors you have, also how many SSPs and DSP. So the CMP should know, you should have the data in your CMP. And then, as I said, in the text, you will just add some kind of placeholder macro thingy so that the CMP can insert the number there.
So I think probably the best thing for a publisher would be to talk to its CMP to check how it's going to be deployed, and maybe just a clarification of what is this number of vendors. So it's the number of vendors for which you establish transparency and consent, so you know which one are going to be disclosed in your CMP. So this is how you can do this to find out this number. And you can also, of course, include non-TCF vendors if you have direct integration with a vendor that do not implement the TCF. Another question maybe for Christoph about reject all button. Is this required? So I'm expecting that this is about the first layer of the CMP UI, and it's a big topic, of course.
It is a big topic throughout legislation, especially in Germany right now and others. It is not required by the TCF policies. It might be required by your DPA or by your local interpretation of the GDPR, but it's not required by the policies, and it was not addressed specifically in the APD ruling. So this is why it's not in there.
Thank you. And it's not in there, but it does not mean that you cannot offer a reject all button to your users. So depending on what your regulator says, TCF policy does not prevent at all the offering of a reject all button on the first layer. Maybe a question for Peter, no, as we also discussed this one previously. Would the update of the GBL require a general reconsent? So for a publisher, does it mean that I need to resurface the CMP UI to all my users to reestablish transparency and consent? Do you want to take this one?
So from a legal perspective, when I give my consent to a certain number of vendors who are involved in the processing, those are the ones to whom I'm giving my consent. So if someone gets added to the list, they are not covered by the consent that I gave, because I was not aware of the processing of my personal data by them. So I did not give my consent to them. So you should already, this should be part of the processes. You really have to think about how you manage consent for any new addition to the list, whether it's today under 2.1 or tomorrow under TCF 2.2. You have to think about how you manage new people, who are new vendors who are coming in, who are added to your list. So you do not need, when we're talking about the update to the GVL, we're not talking about the addition of someone else. What is happening now with TCF 2.2 is that the GVL, the global vendor list, is being updated to include additional information, such as a link to different versions, different languages, linguistic versions of the privacy statement or privacy policy, such as the link to information about where I can find more information about the legitimate interest at stake. And that is additional information that helps me in terms of transparency, but it is not the addition of someone new. And so there, it's ultimately a choice for every publisher to figure out, do I consider that I'm significantly changing the information that I'm providing to users in a way that changes the consent given, but it's not the addition of someone new. And so I think you do have to very carefully think about two separate scenarios here. And here what we're doing is that the update to the GVL is purely about making it more easy for the data subject to find the information they are looking for. And that's not the same as adding a whole series of new vendors and so
on. Thank you, Peter. We also have a question about the last iteration that we presented about the requirement to offer a withdraw all button if it was possible for the user to accept all on the first layer. Maybe Jan, you want to further explain this one and what it means for CMP installation?
Yeah. So the logic is, so you will have this first step that you need to be able to resurface the consent layers in some way. So a floating icon, a link at the bottom, somewhere, something like this. You open the consent layer, you will see the choices page in some way. And if you previously offered an accept all button, then the new rule is that you, now that you're resurfacing this consent layer, also need to have a reject all button, a withdraw all button, whatever you call it. It has some limits to it, but something in this field that will revert the changes. It doesn't necessarily mean that you reject to everything. It can also mean, in a case, I saw there was another question in a similar direction, where you have this, in Germany, you have this poor models where you have accept or pay, basically, some kind of choices. So in these cases, the withdraw would basically mean that you reset your choices and you restart, so to say. You need to do new choices. So it's not necessarily a full reject on everything. It's more a reset. Yeah, something like this.
Yeah, and maybe just also to add, so the idea was to further specify this GDPR requirement that withdrawal of consent should be as easy as giving consent. So the idea is that if the user were able to consent to everything in one click, then you must enable him or her to withdraw consent also to all in one click. So that's kind of the idea behind this policy that has been further specified, because before the wording that was just, make it as easy as giving consent, which was not super clear for everyone. We also have a question about the fact that not all publishers have CMP APIs available in their so installed on the website. What are the options in such scenarios? I'm not sure I understand this question, because in the context of TCF implementation, support for the standard TCF API is mandatory. It's the only way to make available user choices. So I think the scenario would be out of scope of the TCF. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jan, on this one.
Yeah, no. Yeah, if you want to participate in the TCF as a publisher, at least, then you need a CMP, and the CMP must have the APIs. Maybe we're just not fully understanding the question here. Maybe there's a different meaning to the question.
Perhaps while a clarification comes, I think it's useful to just clarify also the previous point about withdrawal versus reject, because I think it's very important to stress this fact that we mentioned already during the slides. This is a requirement that has to do specifically with consent. And so, as Christoph said, it's entirely possible that your local authority might say you need to have a reject that not only covers the consent aspect, but also anything that is based on legitimate interest. That might be the requirement in your jurisdiction by your local authority. It might be the way that you want to proceed and so on. But the requirement in the TCF policy only has to do with consent, because that is the only actual requirement that was imposed by the in the context of the Data Protection Authority's decision in Belgium. So the point about this being a reset, this really has to do with how you are going to implement this. If you only do an accept all in the sense purely of give consent to all, to everything that is based on consent, then you need to have an equivalent button to withdraw consent to all. If you choose that you are going to do an accept all that goes beyond purely consent, that also is a confirmation that I do not object to things that are based on legitimate interest, then of course it is more logical that you have an equivalent button then, because anyway you have a requirement to have a withdraw consent to all button, so it should be as easy. And then it's just an additional step. It could mean, it's ultimately your choice, but it is an additional step to just say, I'm going to do a reject all. But that is not the requirement. And so the reset aspect that Jan was hinting at, this is for consent. Anything based on consent, when you give it easily with one click, you are going to be able to withdraw it easily with one click as well through the same interface. And so it's very important you make that distinction, because it is ultimately your choice how you decide to deal with the aspect of legitimate interest as well.
Thank you, Peter. And we have also a question on the who's liable for the accuracy of the number of partners displayed on the new CMP initial layer. So is it the CMP or the publisher? So I think, Christoph, you will be able to take that one.
Yeah, I try, and maybe Peter can help as well. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. Of course, the publisher is responsible and liable for anything that the publisher is presenting, but TCF, taking from the viewpoint from the TCF standard, is of course a CMP as well, because the publishers do not really register for the TCF. So it's like in this. They have the obligation to have that in there, but it's technically actually done by the CMP. Of course, you are liable for everything that you present on the web when you have a site.
Yeah, CMP. Yeah, sorry, Peter, go ahead.
No, I was just going to confirm the accuracy of the information is actually on the publisher side, because the publisher is the one who manages these relationships with the different vendors. The CMP is purely acting as an intermediary. And of course, it has to make sure that the information so if the publisher says, I have, let's say, 57, because that was the example in the slide, if I have 57 vendors that I'm working with, and it says that to the CMP is not going to suddenly say 55 or 105. That would be a problem of liability for the CMP. But having the right count is the publisher's responsibility.
Yeah, and I think that obviously commercial CMP will automate this counting of vendors, and ultimately they are responsible for the compliance of all of their live installations, so across publisher clients. We have a really good question about, and there are actually several, about how publisher can review and reduce where applicable the list of vendors for which they establish transparency and consent. Is this a legal requirement? Is it better to forget a vendor or to select all vendors? The more vendors, the more secure for the publisher. So maybe Elena, you would be able to discuss this one, as well as the new additional vendor list that has been released.
So the reducing the number of the vendors that comes from the regulator is concerned that the data is broadcasted to as many vendors as are listed in the publishers, like CMP, and then the publisher sort of like does not control who are those vendors, and for that purpose, then and I don't recall exactly, Peter, maybe you'll be able to help me with the whether in which sanction was that in the Belgium APD and how was that criticized. However, that was to improve and TCF's compliance and to reduce that broadcasting to as limited to a limited number of vendors, because this is the that is the essential part of publishers working with few vendors who have, and then having like more restrictive than knowing exactly how those vendors are going to process the data, instead of like broadcasting the data to a large amount of vendors and then losing the control in that respect. And then that is from a publisher perspective, and from a user perspective, then you have a easier. So as a user, when you go on a website and give consent to just a few vendors, then you also have control more onto what you've given consent, and then you know more on how your data is handled, instead of having the hundreds of vendors that are listed in the CMP.
Maybe to add to that, it's basically about transparency, and it's also a GDPR requirement. You have to be accurate and transparent on the vendors that you work with, because and there is certain DPAs also criticizing that if you just get lots of consents for vendors that you never work with, this might be a GDPR violation, and it's not transparent. And furthermore, if you have too many that you actually work with, this might also be a GDPR violation. It depends on the legislation that you are in, and there is no fixed number that you could say like 50 would be okay and 60 not. This like depends on the case and what you do, and also maybe on the purposes and how I wouldn't say intrusive, but how intensive the processing activities is. But first of all, it should be accurate. So you shouldn't just onboard the whole GVL, and it's not something, it's not sufficient. You have to do your due diligence. And we are not actually recommending to reduce vendors, because I saw this question later, but to have an accurate and reasonable amount of vendors, and not, and you even as a publisher, you have to have a look at it, who you onboard in your GPL, in your CMP.
Yeah, and in the GDPR, the publishers and processing data, personal data, they, like everybody actually processing the personal data, they have, from accountability perspective, they need to know how is that data handled when then shared in the downstream. So accountability principle under the GDPR, then it's another legal requirement that falls into place here.
And Jan, you wanted to
just from a very practical perspective, so from the CMP perspective, how you basically find your vendors or the vendors that you don't really use. What you can do in most cases, I mean, in most cases, we're talking about advertising vendors, right? So you will have the typical players like Google or Xandr, or these kind of vendors that everybody is working with, and then you will have secondary vendors. And in very, very many cases, most of the publishers have one main source of income, and in many cases that's Google, and you have some reports there where you see what's the secondary vendor, how much spend or how much earnings do I get from, I don't know, Criteo or from Xandr or from whoever. So you will have a feeling on who is important, who is not important on the one side. The other side is a very technical thing, is most CMPs offer a crawler, some kind of crawling solution, where you will see which vendors are found on your website. And if you run this crawler and your vendor list gives you, I don't know, 1,000 vendors, but your crawler only says it finds 100, then obviously there is something with the other 900. Maybe you don't need them. So you can pay some attention on these vendors and reduce them from your list.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And maybe one last thing to add on this is the fact that last year we requested vendor to provide additional information about their operation to help publisher make an easy selection already of a subset of vendors. So, for example, an easy thing that publisher can do is to stop establishing consent for vendors that operate only in the mobile app environment in their web CMPs and so on their website. They will never touch the data anyway. They can also remove vendors that do not operate in their country and so on. So there are like really easy filter to remove unrelevant vendors and really focus on vendor that makes sense in relation to the to the nature of your website and your advertising operation and so on. So also something to look at, and I think that a lot of CMP can help you with that as well. We have a question which is more about the I think pending litigation. So the Belgian authority said that the TCF v2 is not compliant with GDPR. How those publishers should move on now? And is the last update relevant in terms of day-to-day operations? So I think that right now it's difficult to have to provide some clarity about the Belgian authority decision of last year, simply because we appealed it. And following this appeal, so the Belgian Market Court and the Court of Appeal in Belgium has referred two preliminary questions to the European Court of Justice, and so the case is still pending. So they relate to whether the TC string should be considered personal data and whether IAB rep is a data controller for the processing of the TC string, but also for all of the purposes pursued by vendors. So we still do not have the clarity from the highest court on the case. So it's a bit premature to like draw conclusion about TCF v2. But what we did with TCF v2.2 is clearly trying to address all of the criticism that was contained in the Belgian DPA decision. Without preempting the answer that will be given by the European Court of Justice. I think, Ellen, you put your camera on to remind us that we need to...
I have, yes. And I think some of the attendees will be staying. So in 5 minutes' time, we're going to be switching across, starting a new webinar, and we'll be going through the changes to the technical specifications. So yeah, we're going to have to wrap up very soon, but we've taken a note of all of the questions that have come in. If we haven't got to those, we've documented those, we'll be incorporating those into the FAQs. And then of course, we've mentioned several times that there will be the dedicated webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. So more opportunities to ask questions. Just a big thank you to all of our speakers involved in the TCF steering group for all of your expertise and your knowledge today. And we will see some of you in 5 minutes time, and hopefully the rest of you in a couple of weeks for the stakeholder webinars. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Elena, Stephanie, and Peter.